They auctioned New Meridian on a Tuesday, listed it between a gas giant mining concession and a decommissioned relay station, and the opening bid was accepted before the human delegation had even located the correct hearing room. My name is Director Amara Osei-Bonsu. I am 69 years old. I spent 14 years as a colonial development administrator for the United Earth Settlement Authority, 12 years as the Director of Earth's Interplanetary Infrastructure Division, and the last 11 years as Earth's senior representative to the Galactic Council's Colonial Affairs Committee, a body whose stated purpose was to ensure the equitable treatment of all member species colonial settlements, and whose actual function, as I had understood it for most of those 11 years, was to provide a procedural framework through which the founding 5 species could manage the expansion of other civilizations into space in ways that kept those civilizations permanently behind. New Meridian had 847,000 registered colonists. They had been farming the world's blue clay plains for 60 years. They had built towns and schools and a university that had produced 3 generations of graduates. They had constructed a water management system that the Colonial Affairs Committee's own infrastructure assessment team had cited 18 months before the auction as one of the most efficient on any colony world of comparable development stage. None of that appeared in the auction listing. The listing described New Meridian as a Class C agricultural world with 847,000 registered occupants under protected resettlement status, available for resource extraction development under the Council's Land Reversion and Utilitarian Reassignment Provision, Section 7, Clause 4, which allowed the Council to reclassify any colony world with fewer than 1 million registered colonists as underutilized sovereign territory subject to reassignment if the world had failed to meet its registered development targets within the prescribed timeline. New Meridian had missed its development target by 4.3%. The target had been written into the Colonial Registration Accord 60 years ago, in language so technical and so deeply buried in a document that was 800 pages long that the colonial administrators who had signed it had not understood what they were agreeing to. Earth's legal team had found the provision 14 years ago during a comprehensive audit of all colonial registration documents. They had immediately filed a formal challenge to the provision's enforceability. The challenge had been working through the Council's dispute resolution process for 14 years. It was currently assigned to a review panel that had a standard response window of 6 to 18 months and that had, in practice, not issued a substantive response in the 4 years since the most recent filing. This was not bureaucratic inefficiency. It was the specific, deliberate, carefully calibrated use of procedural delay as a policy instrument. I had understood this for 8 of the 11 years I had sat on the Colonial Affairs Committee. I had filed 47 formal objections in those 8 years. I had won 3 of them on minor procedural points and lost the remainder through a combination of adverse rulings, procedural dismissals, and the specific grinding exhaustion of a process designed to outlast the people trying to use it. On the Tuesday they auctioned New Meridian, I was in the hearing room when the gavel came down. I was there because I had filed an emergency stay application 24 hours earlier, which should have been sufficient to suspend the auction pending review. The stay application had been received, logged, and assigned to a review panel that had a standard response window of 48 hours, which meant the auction had been scheduled to proceed before the stay could be processed, which I was told by the hearing officer was an unfortunate timing coincidence. I had watched the gavel come down. I had collected my data case. I had walked out of the hearing room and into the corridor outside, and I had stood there for approximately 30 seconds, looking at the wall. Then I had opened my secured communicator and transmitted a signal that I had been authorized to transmit for the past 3 years, that I had hoped I would never need to transmit, and that I had known for 3 years was the only response left that mattered. The signal was 8 words. It said, "New Meridian. Begin the 50-year answer." I want to tell you about Dr. James Okafor because nothing that followed is comprehensible without understanding him first, and because he died 22 years before the auction and never saw a single element of what he built put to its intended use. James was born in Lagos in 2029, the son of a civil engineer father and a constitutional lawyer mother, and he spent the first decade of his career doing something that described itself as colonial policy research, and that was, in practice, the most comprehensive systematic analysis of colonial legal frameworks that any human institution had ever attempted. He was reading the fine print, all of it, every colonial registration accord, every land use agreement, every resource sharing provision, every development target clause that Earth and its colonies had signed in the 60 years since humanity had joined the Council. He published his findings in a report that he submitted to Earth's Joint Colonial Authority in 2071. The report was 1,400 pages long. Its conclusion occupied 6 of those pages, and it was the most important document produced by any human institution in that century, though it was classified immediately and remained classified for 31 years. The conclusion was this: that every colonial registration accord Earth had signed contained, in various forms of legal language with varying degrees of technical obscurity, provisions that allowed the Council to reassign human colonial territory under specific conditions, conditions that had been written with sufficient specificity to be precisely applicable and sufficient ambiguity to be resistant to legal challenge, and that had been included in the accords through a process that James, after 14 years of document analysis, was prepared to characterize in his report as deliberate and coordinated rather than coincidental. The Founding Five had written trapdoors into every colonial agreement Earth had ever signed. James had found all of them. His report's conclusion went further. It did not recommend challenging the provisions through the Council's legal process, because James had assessed that process thoroughly and had concluded that it had been designed to produce the outcomes the Founding Five wanted, not to adjudicate disputes between them and junior members in good faith. It did not recommend withdrawal from colonial agreements, because withdrawal would trigger additional provisions that were even more adverse to human interests. It recommended something that nobody had ever attempted before, in the specific way that the most important recommendations are always for things nobody has attempted before. It recommended building something underneath, not instead of the colonial settlements that existed on the surface of every human colony world, underneath them, literally and legally underneath them, using a reading of the Colonial Registration Accord's own language that James had spent 3 years verifying was correct, a reading that found in the same dense, technical, carefully obfuscatory legal text that contained the trapdoors, a different set of provisions that the Founding Five had apparently not noticed they had included, because those provisions were not traps. They were simply the residue of centuries of legal drafting by species who had never needed to read their own documents defensively, because no species they had ever dealt with had read them as carefully as James Okafor had. The provisions James had found established, in binding legal language, that colonial registration applied to surface settlements and surface infrastructure. They established the colonial development targets in terms of surface population density and surface economic output. They defined reassignment eligibility entirely by reference to surface metrics. They said nothing about what was underground. James had died in 2083 of cancer at 54 years old in a Lagos hospital where he had spent the final 8 months of his life working on the framework documents for what he had proposed, because he was the kind of person who worked until he could not. His daughter had told me, at a ceremony 12 years later, that he had spent his last 3 days finalizing the legal verification of the underground infrastructure provisions, because he wanted to be certain the reading was airtight before anyone else had to stake anything on it. It was airtight. The Joint Colonial Authority voted to fund what James had proposed 11 months after receiving his report. The program was given a name that I find perfectly appropriate for something built in the legal interstices of a document nobody thought to read carefully. The Foundation Initiative. The Foundation Initiative's operational structure was, in the specific way of all the important things humanity built in this era, simultaneously extraordinary in its ambition and completely unglamorous in its execution. It had no dramatic headquarters and no memorable name, and it was run, for most of its 50 years, by a succession of administrators who were technically brilliant and constitutionally unsuited to public recognition, which made them exactly right for the work. I was briefed on the Foundation Initiative 9 years before the auction, 2 years before I joined the Colonial Affairs Committee, in a facility built into the bedrock beneath the administrative district of New Carthage, one of the 4 colony worlds that would eventually be auctioned. The briefing was given by Director Yuki Tanaka, who was running the program at that point, and who had the specific quality of someone who has spent 20 years managing something too large and too slow-moving to ever feel finished. She showed me the 3 pillars of the Foundation Initiative, and I want to describe them as she described them to me, because the description she used is the most honest one I have encountered. She said, "James found the trapdoors. We found out what was underneath the trapdoors, and then we built a second house underneath the first one, and made absolutely certain that nothing in the deed to the first house said anything about the second." The first pillar was the underground infrastructure network. Over 47 years, using construction methods designed to avoid detection by the Council's orbital observation systems, every human colony world with more than 200 registered surface colonists had been equipped with a complete secondary civilization beneath its surface. Not emergency bunkers, a full civilization. Residential districts built into cavern systems 2 to 4 kilometers below the surface. Food production facilities using deep geothermal light systems that produced no surface thermal signature. Medical centers fully equipped for independent operation. Educational institutions. Power generation from geothermal sources so deep that the Council's standard orbital thermal scanning could not resolve them. Water processing, waste management. Transportation networks connecting all underground districts through pressurized transit systems. Communication infrastructure using methods that did not require surface transmission. The construction had taken place over 47 years during scheduled surface infrastructure upgrades, using equipment that had been designed to look, from orbit, like standard mining and geological survey operations. Because it was also standard mining and geological survey operations, the Foundation Initiative's engineers had been careful to ensure that every construction operation produced a genuine secondary function that justified its surface appearance. The underground cities were real cities. They had been inhabited on a rotating basis by colonists who were told they were participating in emergency preparedness exercises, which was accurate in the way that describing the ocean as wet is accurate. Over the 47 years of construction, the fiction of emergency preparedness had been so consistently maintained that many colonists had genuinely internalized it as the truth, which had been the intent. By the time of the auction, every human colony world with surface population over 200,000 was also a complete underground civilization capable of housing its entire surface population for a minimum of 12 months without any surface contact. The second pillar was the legal architecture. James Okafor's original finding that the Colonial Registration Accord's definition of colonial territory was limited to surface settlements and surface infrastructure had been verified, re-verified, and verified again by 7 independent legal teams over 31 years. Each team had worked in isolation. Each team had arrived at the same conclusion. The underground infrastructure was not colonial settlement under the Accord's definitions. It was not subject to reassignment provisions. It was not covered by development target calculations. It existed in a legal space that the Colonial Registration Accords had simply not addressed, because the Founding Five's legal drafters had not imagined that anyone would build a second civilization beneath the first one. The legal architecture pillar had also produced something else that James had specified in his original framework, a comprehensive parallel registration system. Every piece of underground infrastructure on every human colony world had been registered under the applicable provisions of 3 different Earth governmental frameworks and 2 allied species legal systems as proprietary human infrastructure predating any reassignment claim by a minimum of 20 years. The registration was legally valid. It had never been disclosed to the Council, because there was no requirement to disclose private infrastructure development that was not covered by colonial registration accords. The third pillar was the transfer protocol. This was the operational element, the system by which, if a surface colony was ever reassigned, The colony's population could be moved to the underground infrastructure within a window that the Foundation Initiative's operations team had refined. Over 20 years of exercises, to a maximum of 6 hours, the transfer protocol was not a dramatic system. It was a logistic system. 47 years of emergency preparedness exercises had produced a population that knew, in the specific bone-deep way of people who have practiced something until it is reflex, exactly what to do when the signal came. Which access point was nearest to their home? Which route to take through the underground transit network? Where to go when they arrived, what to bring and what to leave? How long they had? 6 hours. The exercise had been run 43 times across all human colony worlds. The fastest completion had been 4 hours and 12 minutes. The slowest had been 5 hours and 51 minutes. On the day the auction gavel came down on New Meridian, the colony's surface population had been running quiet transfer protocol preparation drills for 11 years. The winning bidder for New Meridian was a Vethrani Resource Extraction Consortium that had been operating in the outer colonial zones for 30 years. The consortium's lead representative transmitted a landing request to New Meridian's Colonial Administration Office within 4 hours of the auction's conclusion, which was efficient but not surprising. Vethrani extraction operations were well organized, and they had clearly been preparing for this acquisition for some time. The Colonial Administration Office acknowledged the landing request and transmitted a standard response indicating that ground clearance would be provided within 24 hours, pending completion of routine administrative processing. The administrative processing took 23 hours and 47 minutes. During those 23 hours and 47 minutes, New Meridian's surface population of 847,000 colonists completed the transfer protocol, not in panic, not in chaos, with the specific ordered efficiency of people who have practiced the same procedure 43 times over 11 years. Families followed their rehearsed routes to their nearest access points. The access points opened in sequence according to the transfer protocol's scheduled order. The underground transit network carried the population to their assigned districts in the underground city, which had been stocked and operational for the preceding 72 hours by the advanced preparation team that the transfer protocol designated for this purpose. The surface buildings were left exactly as they were. The farms were left with equipment in the field. The university was left with half-completed lesson materials on the desks of empty classrooms. The administration office continued to receive and log transmissions automatically for the next 6 hours. When the Vethrani Consortium's landing team arrived on New Meridian's surface, they found a colony that appeared, on every scanning method available to their equipment, to be in the process of normal daily operation. Thermal signatures from the surface buildings were consistent with normal occupation. Communication traffic from the administration systems was consistent with normal administrative function. The farms showed standard daytime agricultural thermal patterns. There were no people on the surface. The landing team spent 4 hours searching their designated landing zone before transmitting a report to their orbital command vessel that I would summarize as: "The colony appears occupied by all available instrumentation, but we cannot locate any of the occupants." The orbital command vessel spent 6 more hours conducting sensor sweeps before concluding that the colony's population was somehow beneath the surface. At depths their standard geological scanning could not resolve. I received the report from New Meridian's underground administration system, which had been operating continuously since the transfer protocol completed. At 18:30 station time, which was 17 hours after the auction gavel had come down, I was in my office in Geneva at that point. I transmitted a copy of the report to Director Tanaka's office and then opened the secure channel to New Meridian's underground administration director. "Report," I said. "Transfer complete," she said. Her voice was steady in the specific way of someone who has spent 11 years preparing for a phone call and finds when it comes that the preparation was adequate. 847,000 surface colonists confirmed in underground network. Surface infrastructure intact. All systems operational. 0 injuries during transfer. We are ready to proceed to Phase 2 whenever you authorize. I authorized Phase 2. Phase 2 was the legal component, and it was, In James Okafor's framework, the more important of the two. Getting the population underground was the emergency response. What happened next was the permanent resolution. Earth's legal team filed 23 simultaneous submissions to the Council's Colonial Affairs Committee, the Judicial Oversight Board, and the full Council's General Assembly, all within 4 hours of New Meridian's transfer protocol completing. The submissions were the product of 31 years of legal work by a team that had been preparing for this specific moment since James had died with the framework documents in his hands. The first submission was a formal challenge to the land reversion and utilitarian reassignment provision itself, not on the grounds that had been argued for 14 years in the dispute resolution process, but on a newly identified ground that the provision's application to New Meridian was invalid because New Meridian's development target calculation had been based exclusively on surface infrastructure metrics, and that New Meridian's total infrastructure, including underground infrastructure registered under Earth governmental frameworks, exceeded the development target by 340%. The Council's assessment methodology had never been asked to include underground infrastructure in a development target calculation, because no species had ever registered underground infrastructure of significant scale in the relevant way. The calculation, when run with the underground infrastructure included, did not produce a close result. New Meridian was not 4.3% below target, it was 340% above target. The second submission was a request for emergency injunctive relief, preventing the Vethrani Consortium from taking any action affecting New Meridian's infrastructure, on the grounds that the underground infrastructure was registered proprietary human property, not covered by the reassignment provision, and that any action affecting the colony's infrastructure might affect property rights that were not part of the auction's legal scope. The third submission, which was the one I had spent the most time preparing, was a formal notification to all 412 Council member species of the existence of the Foundation Initiative. Not its operational details, not its specifications, but its legal basis and its existence as a response to a systematic pattern of colonial legal manipulation that Earth's legal team had documented over 31 years across 14 human colony worlds, involving provisions in colonial registration accords that Earth's analysis had concluded were not coincidentally adverse but deliberately designed. The notification included James Okafor's original 2071 report. 31 years after it had been classified, it entered the public record. The notification also included a registration status summary for all 14 human colony worlds, not just New Meridian, but all 14. Every one of them had underground infrastructure. Every one of them had completed or nearly completed transfer protocol capability. Every one of them had the same legal status as New Meridian under James's framework. The founding five had auctioned one colony world. They had not known that the colony world they auctioned was the visible surface of something 50 years deep. The Council's response to the simultaneous submissions took 17 days to produce, which was, by Council standards, extremely fast. It was fast because the Judicial Oversight Board's preliminary assessment of the development target recalculation, which it completed in 4 days, because the mathematics were not complex once the underground infrastructure was included, produced a result that the board's presiding officer described in her preliminary ruling as unambiguously dispositive. New Meridian's development target had been met. By a large margin, the auction had been conducted on the basis of an assessment that was either incorrect or incomplete. The board's preliminary ruling suspended the auction outcome pending full review. The full review took 11 months. During those 11 months, New Meridian's surface population remained underground. Surface infrastructure remained intact and maintained by a small automated and volunteer crew, and the Vethrani Consortium's extraction equipment sat at its landing site unused. The consortium's legal team filed 18 objections to the preliminary ruling. Each one was answered by Earth's legal team with documentation that had been prepared for exactly that objection, because Earth's legal team had spent 31 years preparing for all of them. The final ruling confirmed the preliminary finding. New Meridian's auction was voided. The land reversion and utilitarian reassignment provision was suspended pending a comprehensive review of its application to all member species' colonial territories. A review that, when completed 14 months later, produced recommendations that resulted in the provision's fundamental revision, removing the underground infrastructure exclusion and recalculating development targets for every colony world in the Council's registry using methodology that could no longer be gamed by strategic omission. The Vithrani Consortium received a refund of their auction payment. New Meridian's colonists returned to the surface on a Thursday morning, 6 months after the preliminary ruling, when Director Tanaka's office confirmed that the legal situation was sufficiently resolved to make surface habitation safe. I was told that the return took 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was the fastest transfer protocol completion in the initiative's history, though in the opposite direction. I think this is because going home is faster than leaving. James Okafor's name is on a building now. It is the James Okafor Center for Colonial Legal Studies at the University of New Meridian, which is the same university whose classrooms were left with half-completed lesson materials on empty desks on the day the transfer protocol completed. The center was established with funding from the Colonial Authority's reparations settlement, the outcome of a companion legal proceeding that I will not describe in detail here, but whose results included a formal acknowledgement from 3 founding species that the colonial registration accords had contained provisions that were not consistent with the Council's stated principles of equitable treatment. The acknowledgement was 4 sentences long and was drafted by committee and contained no individual admissions, and was worded with the specific, careful precision of institutions admitting the minimum possible while satisfying the maximum possible legal requirement. I had spent 3 days reviewing its final language with Earth's legal team before we agreed to accept it. It was not what James deserved. He deserved a full accounting of what had been done, delivered clearly and without evasion, to the people who had been affected by it. He deserved to have seen it himself. He got the 4 sentences and the building with his name on it, which is more than he had when he died, and significantly less than what his work produced for 847. Those and people who returned to their homes on a Thursday morning without having lost them. His daughter attended the center's dedication ceremony. She had been 12 when he died. She was 44 at the dedication. She stood in front of the building for a long time before she went inside. I stood nearby and watched her face do the thing I had seen on the faces of the children of people who build things they never see completed. The complicated expression of understanding, for the first time, the full shape of what your parent was always tired from. She found me afterward. She said, "He used to say that the most important sentence in any contract was the one nobody read." I thought about 800 pages of colonial registration accords, and a provision buried 300 pages in that had been designed to be missed, and the man who had read every page and found it, and the 50 years of work that had grown from that reading. He was right, I said. I have a house on New Carthage now, which is one of the other colony worlds, that was auctioned in the 3 months after New Meridian, and that went through the same process and produced the same outcome. I moved there because it seemed right to live on the ground that the Foundation Initiative had protected, in the specific way that it seems right to maintain a connection between the work and what the work was for. My granddaughter is 9 years old. She lives with my daughter in one of the underground city's residential districts, because my daughter likes it there. She says the light is different and the noise is different, and that she finds the specific quality of the underground city's sound more conducive to thinking than the surface, which is the kind of preference that you only develop if you have spent significant time underground, which she has, because she grew up running transfer protocol drills. My granddaughter asked me last summer, sitting on the surface in the evening while the colony's sun set over the blue clay plains, what the underground city was for. I thought about how to explain James Okafor to a 9-year-old. Someone, I said, read a very long document very carefully a long time ago and found something in it that other people had missed, and then we spent 50 years making sure that what he found was enough to protect this. She looked at the plains and the sunset and the town lights coming on in the distance. Did it work? She said. Yes, I said. It worked. She seemed satisfied with this in the specific, uncomplicated way of a 9-year-old for whom protection is a fact of life rather than an achievement. She went inside for dinner. I stayed on the surface for a while longer, in the evening quiet of a colony world that had been auctioned and had not been lost, and above me the sky was the particular deep blue of New Carthage at dusk that I had always found more beautiful than anything I had seen on Earth. And below me, 2 kilometers beneath the blue clay plains, the underground city hummed in its quiet and efficient way, full of people who had gone underground and come back up and were now living their lives in the specific, ordinary way of people who have been protected by something they may not fully understand, but that they trust. The trust was the most important thing. James had understood that. 50 years of emergency preparedness drills had not been primarily about operational efficiency, though they had produced that too. They had been about trust. The colonists of New Meridian and New Carthage and the other worlds had run those drills 43 times over 11 years because the people running the drills had been honest with them about the general shape of what the drills were for. Even when they could not be honest about all the details, they had been told, "There may come a day when we need to go underground quickly and quietly and wait. We are preparing for that day so that if it comes, we are ready." It had come. They had been ready. That is not a complicated thing. It is, in fact, the least complicated element of the entire 50 years. Everything else, the legal framework, the underground cities, the transfer protocol, James's reading of 800 pages of colonial accords, was complex and technical and took decades to build and verify. The trust was simple. It just took the same amount of time.